Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.
Kansas Farmers Union, working to protect and enhance the economic interests and quality of life for family farmers, ranchers, and our rural communities. Learn more about our mission of education, cooperation, and legislative advocacy at kansasfarmersunion.org.
Why should people care about the history of sugar?
The history of sugar is important because it's the source of so many of our contemporary problems. It's a very interesting story, and it's a way into understanding why slavery is so important to our understanding of the past. But it's more important because it's an explanation of the way we live now, of the present and of our present discontents.
You are what you eat. It's a tired old saying. We probably heard one of our grandparents say it. But it's true. Our entire body is made out of the things we consume. So, what are we eating? And beyond that, where is it coming from? What's the history? What are the consequences of what we consume? Not just for our bodies, but for our minds. And beyond that, the planet. Because what we often forget is what we eat impacts the world around us. Our air, our water, our soil, our society. Every choice on our plates impacts the world around us in more ways than we often think. Agriculture is not just about growing crops and raising animals. It's about the environment we live in, the economy we rely on, and the future we create. So, let's dive a little deeper, shall we? This is Real Ag. The average American consumes about 100 pounds of sugar a year. Seems like a lot, right? In fact, 200 years ago, the average American ate in 5 days the amount of sugar found in just one 12-ounce soda. On average, we do that once every 7 hours now. Now, what's interesting about that is that until around 600 years ago, this white substance was a rare luxury, pretty much only used by the wealthy and royalty. You pretty much had to be a king or a queen or a duke or some rich aristocrat to even get a hold of this stuff. In fact, you would darn near have to be the Queen of England just to get a bag this size. I bought this for $3. We may not think about it all the time, but we live in a world obsessed with sweetness. It's built industries, built economies, changed our brains, changed our biology, changed our societies. It's even in our language. But despite all the nice words, the story of sugar isn't a sweet one. It's one of slavery, royalty, power, indulgence, and perhaps the decline of human health. This little, simple thing. So join me as we explore just what this substance actually is.
More than I can explain when I'm walking with my sweetness down among the sugar cane.
Now, before we continue, I feel like it's important to address the type of sugar we'll be talking about in this program. When you pick up an apple, that has sugar in it. Any type of fruit is going to have sugar. These are called natural sugars. Natural sugars are found in whole foods, like fruits and some vegetables. It comes bundled with essential nutrients and dietary fiber. Your body digests it more slowly, which provides a steady, long-lasting source of energy. Processed sugars, on the other hand, are sugars that have been separated from their original source, like sugarcane. It's often added to processed foods, sweets, and drinks. Since it's no longer accompanied by the nutrients or the fiber, it causes a quick spike in blood sugar, giving you a sudden burst of energy, typically followed by a crash. Not all sugars are created equal. We will just be talking about processed sugars in this episode. Sound good? All right, moving on.
You fire away, I will answer as best I can, and then you edit down and see how it goes.
This is James Walvin, Professor Emeritus in History. I could spend about 10 minutes talking about his different accomplishments, places he's lectured, the books he's written, but let's just save time by saying he's one of the great historians of our time. He also wrote the book on the history of sugar.
Why should people care about the history of sugar?
The history of sugar is important because it's the source of so many of our contemporary problems. It's a very interesting story, and it's a way into understanding why slavery is so important to our understanding of the past. But it's more important because it's an explanation of the way we live now, of the present and of our present discontents.
So before we get to our present discontents, let's go over sections of this very interesting story. Unfortunately, this isn't a 5-hour-long program where we can go over the exact full history of sugar. So let's focus on some of the more interesting things about this very simple ingredient that we may have forgotten or have been lost to time, starting with its ties to slavery.
The great bulk of Africans, the great majority of Africans shipped across the Atlantic, were shipped across to work in sugar. Now, that doesn't seem an obvious point to make in North America, because although there is a big sugar industry in Louisiana, the great majority of Africans were shipped to the Caribbean and to Brazil. And there primarily they produced sugarcane. There's not enough local people, local indigenous Indians to do it. They either died out or ran away. Not enough Europeans, and Europeans turned to African enslaved labor that they've been using on the west coast of Africa and in Europe earlier, and they turned to that to develop their plantations, and their plantations overwhelmingly were to produce sugar.
Now at this point you might be thinking, hey, I thought you said this stuff was really rare. How did this go from a luxury item to something powering the slave trade? You see, in its early history, sugar was an exotic thing confined to just a few regions around the world, mainly the Middle East and parts of Asia. It was actually known as white gold. And once it made its way to Europe, it was still used very sparingly. The scarcity and the massive amount of labor that was required for sugar's production made it a symbol of wealth and luxury, which was enjoyed by the rich and royalty. However, that dynamic began to change in the late 15th century. With Christopher Columbus's voyages to the Caribbean, sugarcane was introduced to the New World. In fact, it's believed that Columbus actually brought over sugarcane on his first or second voyage. The fertile soil and favorable climate of the Caribbean islands made them ideal for sugar cultivation. As that sugar production expanded, so did the demand for labor. The European colonists initially attempted to use indigenous peoples for labor, but diseases and the harsh working conditions led to a drastic decline in the indigenous population. This labor shortage prompted the use of enslaved Africans, leading to the massive growth of the transatlantic slave trade.
Cane sugar takes over from the 16th century onwards. And it takes over because it's produced in vast quantities by Africans in the Caribbean, in Brazil. Because having established the sugar industry, the European settlers realized that enslaved African labor can be used for all kinds of things, like production of tobacco in Virginia, like later, of course, the production of cotton in the great Mississippi Delta. And so slavery seeps out from its original beachhead, if you will, in sugar, to transform a whole series of commodities which we're so accustomed to, and which we very rarely link back to their origins in slavery.
In modern sugar mills and refineries, the natural juice of the cane is transformed into the sparkling, pure white crystals of high food value, familiar to all as sugar.
Sugar is the commodity that shows Europeans that plantations are the way forward. If they want to make profitable conversion of the land, the way to do it is use plantations and use African American slave labor on it. And they do that for sugar, they do it for rum, they do it for cotton, they do it for coffee. They do it later, of course, for tobacco and for cotton. But the basis of it was hammered out on the sugar plantations.
And there it was, how sugar began to change the Americas. In more ways than one.
Now, this is a really bizarre story because sugar is introduced into the Americas. It's not native there. The Africans are clearly not native to the Americans, and they're producing a commodity to sweeten the food and drink of the Western world, which itself had not been accustomed to sugar before. So what you're looking at is an extraordinary transatlantic and a global mix of peoples and commodities that create a commodity, sugar, that then transforms the habits of the Western world. They mix cane sugar with coffee, with tea, and with chocolate. Chocolate comes from Mexico, the Aztecs. Tea comes not from India, but from China. And coffee comes from the Horn of Africa. You've got three commodities which are exotic, mixed with another commodity which is also exotic, sugar. And it becomes absolutely basic to the Western world.
Sugar began changing everything. It changed societies. It changed what we looked at as a class. It changed food. It changed drink. It changed industries. But it also changed our health.
And it's interesting that the first people that have really lousy teeth because of sugar are the wealthy. The poor don't have bad teeth because they don't eat sugar. And the curious thing is that the work that's been done by archaeologists on skeletons really expose it quite clearly. That those people from, let's say the 15th century onwards, who are using cane sugar, have dental problems. Queen Elizabeth I had terrible teeth, and people always talked about it. Louis XIV had all his teeth out. He never smiled because he just showed his gums. You know? It's a horrific story of the dental treatment in the pre-anesthetic days. But they lost their teeth because they liked their sugar.
And there you have it, the very beginning of what we could see as the health effects of sugar. Now, since then, we've found a host of other problems that too much sugar can cause. But new research is shedding light onto the problems we haven't been able to see. How sugar affects the brain.
I've been studying this for quite a while. It's starting to make me feel old, but that's okay.
No, I mean, it's some cool work. I think if you're to be involved in anything in neuroscience, this is pretty cutting edge stuff.
Yeah, thank you. It's cutting edge in a different way, I feel like, because so much of neuroscience has been focused on the technology and, you know, all these sort of like minute little details that we can now learn about with the advancement in technology over time. But I feel like, you know, the stuff that we've been studying in my lab has been more cutting edge on the side of like, wait, maybe we need to think about things differently. Maybe we need to think about obesity and overeating differently. So it is different in that way.
This is Nicole Avina. Nicole is a psychologist and neuroscientist. For years, she's been doing experiments in her lab that study our relationship with food, and in particular, the intricate dance between the brain, addiction, and nutrition. With a deep expertise in both neuroscience and psychology, Dr. Avina has carried out some of the most amazing experiments on how sugar affects the brain. She also just wrote a new book on sugar, and it's fantastic.
We initially in my lab, we started off doing a lot of rat studies. And so this was done because we were first starting this whole journey of studying whether or not food could be addictive. And, you know, clearly it would be very difficult to find humans that have never had sugar, right, for them to be in our control groups. But lab rats are, you know, pretty easy to manipulate their diet. We can have a control group that never has sugar. And so a lot of our early work was actually looking at the role that sugar can have in the brain. And we were using rats as our models. And there have been some studies that had come out around this whole idea of, would rats prefer sugar over other addictive substances like cocaine? And when it was discovered that, rats were preferring sugar over taking cocaine, I thought that that was just extremely telling, because it's showing us that, they're preferring to take something that we all view as being not really as bad as cocaine for us, right? But if rats are making that volitional choice that they would prefer to have that, it really does tell us something about the addictive nature of the substance and how it can affect our brain. And I think, knowing that on the background of how pervasive sugar is in our society, it's kind of scary.
It is pretty scary. Sugar has been so normalized that we don't even really think about when we add too much of it to something. If you go to a coffee place and ask for a couple extra pumps of sweetener, they don't even think twice about it. But if you called a coffee place and asked if they could sprinkle some cocaine in your drink, they wouldn't do it, right?
I was wondering if instead of sugar, if you guys could just put some cocaine in my coffee.
Now, this went this way because cocaine is seen as a drug and sugar is just seen as food. But is sugar a food? Or is it closer to something like an addictive drug?
So in your book, you talk about how dopamine is a hallmark of drug addiction, and the spikes are very similar in sugar. Could you talk about that a little bit?
So one of the things that we were interested in studying when we first started doing these studies, trying to assess whether or not sugar could be addictive, was whether, in terms of the brain, sugar looked like an addictive substance. So we had conducted a variety of different behavioral experiments to demonstrate some of the behaviors that are typical of an addiction. But when we look in the brain, one of the things that we know from the literature is that neurochemicals like dopamine are released every time someone uses a drug of abuse. And this is regardless of the type of drug, whether or not it's nicotine, alcohol, morphine, heroin. That's really the hallmark of drug use, because every single time a person uses it, it's going to release dopamine in the reward-related regions of the brain. So the big question we had was, well, what about sugar? Is sugar going to behave like a drug in terms of the brain, or is it going to look more like a food? Because normally food does not release dopamine every single time it's administered. It's really only the first couple times you try a new cuisine that dopamine is released. And so that was really the big question that we had. And when we conducted the experiment, we found that, lo and behold, every single time sugar was administered, it was releasing dopamine in these reward-related regions, just like what you would see with a drug of abuse. So this was another indicator that sugar can produce an addiction-like response, not only in terms of behavior, but now also in terms of the way the brain is functioning.
And over time, the baseline changes, right? Where you need more and more of it to kind of get that similar feeling, just like with a drug, correct?
Absolutely. So we see what's known in classic psychology 101 as the opponent process theory kicking in, where you start off on a baseline and you use the substance and it makes you feel great, and then you stop using it and you go back to baseline. Well, what happens with drugs and alcohol, and also with sugar, is that the baseline shifts over time. And so now people's baselines are dropping. And so they're waking up in the morning and just wanting sugar to try to get back to feeling normal. And that's dangerous. And that's why so many people who are struggling with addiction find that it's difficult for people to really understand why they can't stop. They're not using the substance to feel good anymore. They're using the substance just to try to feel normal. And that's because of these changes in the brain that ensue when the substance is used repeatedly and these neurochemicals are repeatedly released.
So there you have it. Just like a drug of abuse, you use sugar and it just makes you want it again. And it makes you want more because your baseline is changing. It's going to take more sugar to get you that similar high that you're used to. But new research has shown that sugar could be changing something else.
Can you talk about the concept of sugar babies?
Yes. So the concept of sugar babies is interesting. And so this has kind of come about After we started doing research on how sugar affects the brain and our behavior, one of the things that I got interested in was trying to figure out what's the genesis of sugar addiction? Like, when does this start? And we started doing some research looking at the role that sugar can have during pregnancy. And we wanted to see whether or not there was an impact of sugar on the offspring. And so we conducted some studies, and there's been lots of other studies that have been conducted in this space too, looking at the role of sugar during pregnancy. And what we found is that when babies are exposed to sugar in utero, it can have an effect not only on their preference for sugar later on, but it can also have an effect on their proclivity to consume other drugs. So we did an initial study in our lab rats where we found that when we give the rat moms sugar during pregnancy, they give birth to babies that grow up and consume more sugar. They grow up to become overweight, and they also grow up to consume more alcohol and be more sensitive to amphetamine. And what's really interesting about many of these rats in this particular study is that they only were exposed to sugar in utero. It's not like they were raised on it or, consuming it all throughout their childhood. It's only when they were exposed to it in utero. The brains of these babies are changing as a result of the mom's diet. And this can lead to a situation that I think is what we're in now, where many women are giving birth to babies that are born already addicted to sugar because their moms have been consuming it throughout their pregnancy. And that's really just setting them up for a lifetime of struggles. So we really need to start to think about how we can intervene earlier and earlier and earlier to make some of these dietary changes so that we don't continue down this vicious cycle.
Now, at this point, you might be feeling like, well, I eat a lot of sugar, and this is making me feel guilty for eating so much sugar. But you shouldn't necessarily feel guilty. Our society and food supply has conditioned us to eat too much sugar.
If you take a look at the processed foods in our food supply, which we've become reliant on to survive, you can see that sugar is in about 80% of them. And so if we're talking about something that is so pervasive that when people do really kind of wake up and realize, wow, we need to cut back on this stuff and really come up with some other strategies on how we want to nourish ourselves, it's going to be very difficult because the vast majority of the food contains it.
Try finding a soup with no added sugar. Try finding potato chips or bread with no added sugar. If you start flipping around packages, you'll be pretty surprised how much sugar is in everything. You could even go to the drive-thru right now and get a coffee that has so much sugar in it, it's comparable to what an average American ate in 2 weeks 200 years ago. We can have that as a drink now, for one meal.
So, people like me who are molecular biologists, we like to break things and then fix them to understand if that's really how they work. So that's how geneticists think, and I am a geneticist.
This is Monica Deuce, molecular biologist, geneticist, and professor at the University of Michigan. Monica's lab studies sugar on fruit flies, rats, and other creatures in hopes of understanding our own relationship with sugar a little bit better. Her research was also the inspiration for the scientific comic book Sugar Buzz, which can be found for free on the Real Ag website. We could have a whole episode on just Monica and my conversation because the work she does at her lab is fascinating, but the bit of our conversation that stuck out the most was this.
So less sugar, you taste sugar more sweet. So the implication, right, is that, well, does more sugar make us taste less, sweetness less? And those studies are currently undergoing, but in my lab, we have modeled that process in animals because then, the animals, we can decide essentially what diet to give them, and so we can control really accurately how much sugar they're getting. Anyway, when we give this animal model sugar, we find that their tongues essentially becomes less sensitive to sweetness. And so you can say that our human study shows that let sugar makes us taste sweetness more, and our animal studies suggest that more sugar makes you sense sugar or sweetness less.
Pretty crazy, right? It seems that the more sugar we eat, the less we're even able to taste it. And going back to the brain, the more sugar we eat, the more we need to get back to that baseline high. Pretty vicious cycle we've got going. Especially in a society where sugar is added to everything. So, what can we do?
We did a study in our lab. We gave rats the regular rat food, which is kind of like dog food essentially, little pellets, and then we gave them sugar water instead of water, and then measure their responses, their ability to taste sugar after 4 weeks. And we did this by essentially looking at how potently one of their taste nerves responded to different concentration of sugar, and it was like 50% down. So this is not a subtle effect. After 4 weeks of just drinking sugar water instead of regular water with the regular food, which didn't have much sugar, this rat's ability to respond to sugar was decreased by 50%. Then what did we do? We take those same rats and we give them just water for 4 weeks. So sugar for 4 weeks, then just water for 4 weeks. The food is the same. Then we measure their responses again, and they return to normal. The taste buds renew between 7 and 10 days. So that doesn't take very long, and we know that the system is really tuned to what you give it. We know that our taste buds can learn to like the new foods as much as the old food within weeks. So if at first, that cereal or that food doesn't taste as good, just give it time, train yourself. Think about making planks or doing laps for your taste buds. And then, very much like you can't go from sitting on the sofa to running 5 kilometers or 3 miles. It's the same thing. It takes time to train your taste buds for a more helpful, approach to life.
The journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, and choosing fruit 1 or 2 times a week versus a high sugar option could be the start to a healthier life. So, to finish this all out, I had all of our experts describe sugar in 3 words.
Sweet, tasty, and pernicious.
Delicious, inconspicuous, and insidious.
The silent killer.
So there you have it. While sugar might sprinkle a bit of magic on our taste buds, it's not exactly fairy dust for our bodies. Consuming too much of this sweet stuff can lead to a lot of health issues, including the health issues we can't even see. So let's do better. Let's save that sugar rush for special occasions and treat our bodies right. Let's take the time to flip around those packages and maybe start to appreciate that life is sweet enough.
Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.
Kansas Farmers Union, working to protect and enhance the economic interests and quality of life for family farmers, ranchers, and our rural communities. Learn more about our mission of education, cooperation, and legislative advocacy at kansasfarmersunion.org.